Mr. Lim Guan Eng, the Right Honourable Chief Minister of Penang, Dr. Lim Kim Hua, CEO of Penang Institute, Professor Hans van der Ven, our distinguished speaker of the evening, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to each and every one of you. My name is Jan and I'll be your MC for this evening. The Penang Institute, in collaboration with the Oxford and Cambridge alumni of Penang, is proud to jointly organize the talk entitled Operation Ichigo, China's Turning Point, as part of the Penang in Asia lecture series. Tonight, we shall look into one of the three important operations during World War II, Operation Ichigo. This lecture will ultimately help us analyze the communist response to Japan's offense and its impact on China's international relations, especially with the US. Without further ado, I now invite Dr. Lim Kim Hua, CEO of the Penang Institute, to give his welcoming address.
The Right Honourable Chief Minister of Penang, Mr. Lim Guan Eng, Senator Arifin Omar, Professor Hans van der Ven, a warm welcome and good evening to everyone. Penang Institute is the state government public policy think tank, and we envisage to bring new ideas and making ideas work in Penang. So as part of our public lecture series, we are proud to organize this Penang in Asia lecture series. This lecture series is our flagship lecture, and it aims to bring together renowned scholars, public intellectuals, and thinkers from diverse fields to Penang. So we have covered many topics over the many years, and such as lessons from the global financial crisis conducted by Professor Nishimura from University of Tokyo. Professor Jeffrey Sachs had previously delivered a lecture on sustainable development. Likewise, Professor Tariq Ramadan has talked about Islam and human rights in worldwide. Last year, we had the honor of also Professor Oppenheimer from Oxford, who talked about origins of Southeast Asian ancestors. And in the first lecture of this Penang in Asia series, we had Professor Wu Wing Tai, who talked about the return of China to the world stage. So indeed, this sets the scenes for tonight's lecture. China has returned to the world scene, and it has risen rapidly in the last few decades. China has become the largest trading partner for many countries, and likewise for Penang. Its rise has been quite phenomenal, and in the start of this year, when China sneezed, we could see that the financial markets tumbled continuously for almost 6 weeks. So the rise of China, of course, brought about several flashpoints. Say, for example, the South China Sea island disputes, but it also brought about opportunities. Say, for example, the One Belt, One Road initiative by China. So as we see, understanding China is perhaps very important in this juncture of our development. So that brings us to the 8th lecture series, to be conducted by Professor Hans van der Ven from Cambridge University. Professor van der Ven is a professor of modern Chinese history, and his research is in the area of early history of the Chinese Communist Party, the Chinese Revolution, and China's modern military history. So it bodes very well with the topic of tonight, which is Operation Ichigo. Many of us do not know about this, and indeed it has not really been well researched globally. So to me, it seems like a hidden gem to be discovered. Compare this to Operation Overlord, the D-Day operation in France, which has spurred many new stories, new ideas. For example, Saving Private Ryan, a Hollywood movie, produced in 1998. It was very well received. Of course, it had Tom Hanks and was directed by Steven Spielberg, and it grossed more than $480 million worldwide. So many of us have enjoyed the movie. Tonight, what we aim to bring about is for you to enjoy a different aspect of the Second World War. And with this, I hope that everyone will leave this lecture more enlightened and see a different view and perspective of China and the Second World War. So, a warm welcome to everyone, and I hope you enjoy the lecture tonight. Thank you.
Next, I will now call upon Mr. Lim Guan Eng, the Right Honourable Chief Minister of Penang, to deliver his opening speech.
Thank you. Dr. Lim Kim Hua, the CEO of Penang Institute, Professor Hans van der Ven, the distinguished speaker for tonight, Dr. Rachel Liao, the lecturer in history at Cambridge University, Senator Arifin, of course, all the distinguished guests who have gathered here to hear a very notable speaker who has come all the way from Europe to enlighten us with 72 years history of a battle that I think very few of us are aware about. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome. Selamat malam and salam bersih to everyone. Now we are delighted to have Professor Hans to be with us today, and I understand this is his first trip to Penang. So selamat datang ke Pulau Pinang. Now regard must be paid to history in order for us to understand how Chinese civilization, of course, how Asian civilization has endured and even thrived. What is significant in this lecture is how this specific episode in history has enabled the Chinese communists to rise into power, shaping many factors that we see today. Most obvious of all is the cross-strait relationship between mainland China and Taiwan. Of course, some may not quite agree, but it's because of this Operation Ichigo that the Chinese communists were well poised to defeat the Nationalists during the Civil War and took power. So perhaps they should send a word of thanks for what the Japanese did to the Nationalist military forces. Now, whilst Professor Hans will deliver a lecture on the history of China, especially during the Second World War, I would like to share with you Penang's growing relations with the two main actors in the lecture, Japan and China. Penang, as everyone knows, was a trading post established by the British in 1786. Our rich diversity was honoured by the award of the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Georgetown. And thanks to these historical links, Penang has the advantage of developing close business relationship with both Japan and China. Penang has played significant roles in the rise of modern China as well as modern Japan. Sun Yat-sen, the founding father of the Republic of China, made Penang his base, and he stayed here for nearly 2 years. Penang was instrumental in the financing of the revolution in China. Likewise, a Penang boy struck up a close business relationship with Mr. Soichiro Honda, the Honda Super Cups creator. The introduction of Honda motorcycles revolutionized mobility in Malaysia and the region. The cheap and reliable Honda Cups accelerated urbanization and growth in Malaysia, and in the process made the local Penang boy a very rich tycoon. Now, during the 70s and 80s, Japan emerged as a major provider of development aid, and Japanese companies invested heavily in South Asia. Penang was one of the favoured destinations where Japan made massive investments, especially in the automotive and E&E sectors. Japan emerged as the largest foreign direct investor in Malaysia, with an investment of 26.3 billion ringgit between 2009 and 2013. And undoubtedly, Penang is one of the largest recipients of these investments. For example, in 2014, Japanese electronics and ceramics producer Ibidin Corporation invested 1.3 billion ringgit to ramp up production in Penang. And this is their biggest operation in Asia. Besides investment, Japan has also developed strong trade ties with Penang and is consistently one of Penang's 5 largest trading partners. The trade ties between Japan and Penang has recently been strengthened, as can be seen from an MOU signed by Japan and Penang Halal Hub Development in 2014 to promote halal products from Japan and Penang. Besides, with Japan and Malaysia being part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement (TPPA), we can look forward to closer business and investment ties in the future. And further, the number of Japanese long-term residents, mostly retirees, have almost doubled since 2008, from 1,500 to 2,900 presently. I always like to joke with the Japanese Consul General in Penang that whilst the population of Japan may be declining, but the number of Japanese in Penang is increasing. And that shows the attractiveness and appeal of Penang. But Japan is not the only force that contributes to the transformation of Penang. China, a rising world economic power, plays an increasingly important role. Today, China is the biggest trading partner for Penang, accounting for about a fifth, 20% of Penang's total trade. China's biggest trading partner in ASEAN is Malaysia, with a two-way trade that benefits or that favors Malaysia. China's rise as an economic and political power in the Asia-Pacific region is almost unparalleled and has significant implications for the growth and development of Penang. And we should position ourselves accordingly as the economy of China rebalances and also recalibrates. The economic rise of China can be seen as an engine of growth, and Penang can ride on it, from inward investments, trade and business opportunities to tourist arrivals. Chinese President Xi Jinping introduced in 2013 the One Belt, One Road policy, combining two main components, the Silk Road Economic Belt and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road, to promote infrastructure development in Asia, Middle East, South Asia and of course Southeast Asia, to enable deeper economic connectivity and cooperation. Alongside this initiative, the Chinese government has established Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank (AIIB) and the Silk Road Fund to finance infrastructure construction. Now, Penang is poised to benefit from this initiative. Now, even before this policy was implemented, nationally owned Chinese construction companies, owned by the People's Republic of China, have made inroads and a big impact in Penang, securing contracts in land reclamation, building bridges, roads, undersea tunnels and water dam projects amounting to 14.3 billion ringgit. The 27 billion ringgit Penang Transport Master Plan offers another opportunity. Now, this transport plan will transform the transport infrastructure in Penang by building public transport such as LRT monorail, cable cars, water taxis, as well as buses and taxis, to move people and not vehicles, to overcome traffic congestion and improve connectivity. Now, we welcome Chinese and Japanese participation in this project. By securing and strengthening the critical infrastructure, we will help Penang to strengthen cross-border connectivity and regional integration with the goal of creating strategic channels, trade and industrial hubs, as well as cultural exchanges. Penang will stand to have better links to support economic growth and trade, not only in Malaysia but also throughout the region, so that we can realize our dream of becoming an international and intelligent city in the region. A few days ago, US Secretary of State John Kerry visited Hiroshima, commemorating the victims of the 1945 US atomic bombing. In that visit, he reaffirmed the need for nuclear arms curbs globally. So let us not forget the perils and horrors of war. Although the bombing of Hiroshima ultimately led to the end of the Second World War, Hiroshima was devastated and close to 140,000 people were killed by a single bomb. Either died from the direct impact or indirectly through radiation exposure. For this reason, Penang has taken the lead in Malaysia by being the first state in rejecting nuclear power generation. As you may be aware, the Malaysian government intends to build 2 nuclear power reactors. We feel that the risk of failure is too great to bear, especially for our children. And for that reason, we have written to the federal government saying that we will not allow any nuclear power reactors in Penang. And they have replied to say that they will not build it in Penang. These are one of the powers that the state government has. We can prevent nuclear power reactors. I mean, after all, can you trust the Malaysian government to regulate nuclear power reactors properly? Even the roofs of stadiums can collapse. Even the roof of parliament can leak. And yet they want to manage nuclear power reactors. And for that reason, in the hands of unprofessional regulators that are prone to be interfered due to political considerations, inefficiency, and even corrupt practices, we say, better be safe than sorry. After all, if Germany, the most scientifically advanced country in the world, can ban and intends to close down all nuclear reactors by 2023, if I'm not mistaken, we should be following suit. When Germany is shutting down nuclear reactors, we are building 2 more. I do not know which state will be so lucky. But I'm sure that if they want to seek a refuge from these nuclear reactors, Penang welcomes them with open arms. Now, in many respects, both China and Japan share many similarities in emerging triumphantly from the ashes of the Second World War to be a major economic power second only to the United States. Both were generally homogeneous ethnically, relying on the yearning by their people to restore national dignity, respect for meritocracy, and the talent of its people, allowing the unshackling of hard work, enterprise, and expertise, as well as unleashing of creativity and innovation of its best and brightest. More importantly, both had national leaders and national institutions that were suited to bring out the best, in their people, to move forward and not backwards. In China, despite the disasters of the Great Leap Forward in the 50s and the Cultural Revolution in the 60s, China somehow remained whole and united as a nation. Never underestimate the importance of national dignity. After 150 years of continuous humiliation by the West, the Chinese were not willing to replace their own dictator with a foreign dictator. So even though Mao made many mistakes, he still died peacefully in bed. And the Chinese were well primed to be unleashed by Deng Xiaoping to work themselves out of poverty, transforming the poorest Asian country in the 60s to become the second largest economy in the world 50 years later. Unlike the homogeneity of Japan and China, Penang's diversity can be a role model of how different cultures can live peacefully together. Diversity is celebrated and differences respected and accepted as a way of life in Penang. Temples, churches, and mosques exist and practice their faith side by side. For example, in Thaipusam, Singaporeans marvel how we can make so much noise during Thaipusam. because in regimented Singapore, they have to celebrate it quietly. That's why they come to Penang to let themselves go. And you know, you go and to Waterfall, houses mostly resided by the Chinese, and yet they accept that inconvenience for 3 days as part of their lives. Never complaining, never scolding, but accepting that cultural practice and respecting the Hindus for that celebration. And I think that is the beauty of Penang. Accepting and celebrating others' different faith and practices. It is this unique cultural heritage and religious harmony that UNESCO rightfully awarded Georgetown as a World Heritage Site. I am proud, on behalf of the Penang State Government, that on this small island of Penang, we are also able to celebrate traditional Japanese and Chinese festivals and enjoy and learn from each other's heritage. The Japanese not only celebrate Bon Odori, we also have the Yosakoi procession. And this is something that shows that Penang is open, an open, cosmopolitan, international city. I believe that this evening's lecture will be an interesting perspective of the Second World War and perhaps provide a glimpse into the future. And looking at the crowd tonight, I'm sure, Professor, you have attracted a crowd that would be worthy of any famous academic. I must say that I have not heard of you until you came to Penang. So you must be someone remarkable. Well, I regret that I have another appointment that I have to rush to, so I will miss, I'm sure, your illuminating lecture. But as I said, we want to encourage great minds here to think, not only to understand past events, but to use that as a basis for us to face the challenges of the future. And I'm sure that you will return again to us, since you are so much welcome here. I'm sure you return again to Penang to share your thoughts, because understanding the past is important to enable us to connect with the present, so that we can successfully face the challenges of the future together. Enjoy your evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chief Minister. Now I'd like to pass the floor to our moderator of the evening, Dr. Lim Kim Hwa. And now let's put our hands together to now I'd like to pass the floor to Professor Hans for lecture first. Okay, thanks.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you for the Chief Minister of Penang, Dr. Lim Kuan Ing, to open the evening's procedures. Thanks to Kim Hwa for inviting me to come here tonight and give this talk, and thank everybody for coming here to listen to me talk about a subject that I care a great deal about, that I've been working about for a long time, and hopefully will be interesting to you. I should mention that one of the reasons, besides giving this lecture, that I'm here is because I represent my college, St. Catherine's College in Cambridge, where Tunku Abdul Rahman, of course, was a student, and one of the things we are doing is we received some funding about 15 years ago to invite fully funded PhD students to come. And so our purpose in coming to Malaysia is to sort of reinvigorate that old link, to create channels that will help us make sure that we have absolutely the brightest students to come to Cambridge in various fields of the arts and humanities, not the sciences, but the arts and humanities. And so that is sort of one of the reasons that I'm here. I normally work on China, so sort of my mental world is more China than Malaysia, although I think it's been lovely to have the chance to have come here a couple of times. Actually, I think you're very lucky to live in Penang, and I hope to come back many times. I think it's probably good that the Chief Minister left, because I have to correct him. He said that maybe China should thank Japan for invading, Beijing should thank Japan for invading China because it led to the Communist Party being in power. Actually, that has already happened a couple of times. Mao Zedong, when China and Japan re-established relationships in the first discussions that began in the 50s actually, but again in the 70s, Mao Zedong very generously literally thanked Japan for invading China because, and I quote, otherwise we would still be in the hills. And he would be. And sort of the point of today's lecture is really to understand Mao did this kind of cynical stuff all the time, and he had that way with words. But there is a great deal of truth to that assessment. But before turning to my sort of main theme of Ichigo, I want to explain why I'm doing this and why I find World War II so important to talk about. And the reason for that is that I think World War II has become increasingly something like what I would call an axial moment. An axial moment being sort of a new beginning in history. Sort of the last axial moment before this one really is when the great philosophers, the great religious leaders emerged, and everybody traces their history to that. So Europe traces its history to the Greeks and so on. But today, certainly in Europe, in America, and increasingly in China too, it's the Second World War that is seen as the founding narrative, not just as for when these political institutions, political arrangements, the geospatial arrangements of the Second World War, of the world that we know today, but also as sort of the moral anchors that we live by, also emerged at that time. And so I think it's in understanding how that world, politically, geostrategically, but also morally, ethically, came about, the time in which we live, we have to pay attention to the Second World War. And if China, a generation ago, would tell its national history, its founding history, as the history of revolution, now it is the struggle against Japan, out of which the new China emerged. And of course, the same is true for the UK, for the United States, for other countries, for Germany, for other countries in Europe. So this is a very important topic. What I will say today is part of an ongoing project about China. The title of the project is China at War. China at War from 1937 to 1953. You might wonder why I chose those dates. 37 is easily understandable, it's when the Japanese invasion began. 53 is really, I think, when the fighting, the real fighting, the violence that came out of World War II ended in East Asia, although not in Southeast Asia. So I don't think 45 is actually a significant turning point, and we'll come back to that later. But I also call the book China at War because this year in China, as I'm sure many of you know, China made a lot about sort of the 70th anniversary of the fall of Japan and so on. But China was at war as saying sort of we unitedly fought Japan. Out of that came the new China. But China in reality, I think for two reasons really, China in reality was not just at war with Japan, but it was also at war with itself, internally. It's the nationalists, the communists, collaborationist Wang Jingwei government, many other sort of warlords. All kinds of different events China could have gone in very many different directions. The decision that it would go into a communist direction really comes out of World War II. So for me, China at War was a very violent period in which It wasn't just Japan that was the issue. It was the issue was, what kind of China do we want? What kind of China are we going forward to? And sort of those decisions were made at that time. And I think that's very, very important to realize. It is not simply a heroic struggle of overcoming Japanese aggression. It is also the story of making decisions about, okay, we do not want the old China, we do not want a China under imperialist control, but what kind of new China do we want? And I think in many ways, as I will suggest today, the communists won the arguments. It was more than just a military set of issues. It was also an argument about history, and I will come back to that, where China came from, as well as about the future. And one reason that I am doing this kind of research today is because I think when we use the term World War II, which we all do, it is a term that is, I think, that runs the risk of homogenizing history, making all history the same. It is a homogenizing term that sees everything that happens around the world as a struggle between goodies and baddies, democratic nations, fascist nations, a global struggle against fascism. And I think that it is time that we move beyond that kind of interpretation and see how different the war was in all the regions in which it took place. It was never just about one thing or the other. There was lots of more things going on. In Europe, yes, it was about the defeat of Germany. But in East Asia, it was about the defeat of Japan, but also emerging out of imperialism. So a very different set of stories. And of course, in America, it was about something different yet again. In the Middle East, it played very different roles in areas of the world I don't know much about. So I think it's time for us to begin to resist that homogenization of this term, the Second World War, and see how different it was, how different it played out. I think there is a Second World War, but there is many more things coming out of it. So my charge, if I can put it that way, my charge is that much of World War II today remains highly defined by a UK-US definition of World War II. To reinforce that point, at the time, nobody talked about the Second World War. As my Cambridge colleague, David Reynolds, pointed out some time ago, and he is a very good writer, much funnier than I will ever be, as he put it, and I quote, "It was only in 1948 that the British government decided that it just had been fighting the Second World War. It had to make that decision about sort of unit histories of the military. The war had to be called something. They decided for the Second World War. What was it called in England at the time, or in Britain at the time? It was simply the war, the Great War, not the Second World War. Russia, very important, Russia talked about the Patriotic War, not about the Second World War. China talked about Kanrejianguo Zhangzheng, the war against Japan and for national reconstruction. Jianguo is now often forgotten, but the Kangre remains in place. They didn't talk about the Second World War. They didn't. So they were, as I've already said, for fighting for a set of different issues. It was the United States, it was of the European countries, it was only Germany that talked about a world war, a Weltkrieg. They were the losers. They didn't get to say how this war was going to be called. It was, of course, the victors in the end. But it was Roosevelt who began to use that term, the Second World War, in order to push the Americans, before Pearl Harbor, towards seeing why America, too, should be fighting. And he made the point that this war should be about free trade, an end to empires, and self-determination. That's the kind of war, that's what he used in terms of, that's why he called it a world war. America goes to war to improve the world, not to save European empires. And that's an issue actually that ran through much of it. So if we keep using this term, or when we use this term Second World War, I think we should do so, we should continue to do so, but we should be aware of the historical background and the historical baggage. If Mao was still alive, he would have called it this was a capitalist war. That is the kind of war that came out of it, although also some other things, of course. And so for me, 1945, as I said already, is not an important moment. It is an important moment, but it's not a decisive moment. The fall of Japan is not decisive because the violence goes on. China immediately goes into the civil war. This is true not only for China, it is also true for Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, this area as well, and so on. So just take 45. The reason people took 45 as saying this is the end of the war is because it suited the needs of politicians at the time in America who wanted to bring the boys home. Of course, the UK as well. Japan actually suited it as well. But in the reality of violence continued to be in place for just about everybody in East and Southeast Asia. And I think in East Asia, when America comes back on the mainland in the Korean War, we find some sort of stability as everybody begins to be sort of too exhausted to keep fighting. Chiang Kaishek is in Taiwan. The US is not going to go into the rest of China. There's a form of stability. And so then the shape of China, we know now, the shape of East Asia, we know now, is set in place at that point. Now, I'm going to get some water. The reason I take 1944 as a significant moment is because the Chief Minister already said. That is because there were three important battles, one of which most Europeans and Americans know a great deal about. It is D-Day. It's the Private Ryan film, which we can talk about if you want. I have deep problems with it. The other campaign, so D-Day began on the 6th of June. Bagration, that is the Russian advance through Ukraine and Poland, began 2 weeks later as the result of a deal negotiated a year earlier in Tehran. And so that begins the fight against Germany. Those two were great Allied victories, and that is one reason why we don't know much about the third great campaign, which is the campaign of Ichigo, which really is, in Japanese, that simply means Operation Number 1. And presumably here people do know about Operation Number 2, the Ugo offensive of the Japanese in Burma against Imphal and Kohima, which when I talk to British students, they have never heard of, let alone as well. Here it must be well known. Now, yes, that will do. Ichigo was a defeat. It was also the largest land campaign that the Japanese army ever took. It was the largest land campaign of the war. It involved 500,000 troops, 100,000 horses, and this whole idea of 100,000 horses in a country that doesn't actually support horses begins you to say something about the logistics that the Japanese had to have in place in order to carry out this campaign. Some 1,500 artillery pieces, 800 tanks, 1,500 mechanized vehicles, hundreds of airplanes. And if we think of the China War as sort of unmechanized, as the picture we saw on the handout, but Ichigo was a truly modern, industrialized, conventional type of war, with lots of air raids and bombings and all that stuff, and tanks operating. You get these pictures we are much more used to seeing from Europe. They were happening at Ichigo in China. And on the map that you see, I just wanted to show you how large this campaign is. It went all the way, really from the north all the way to Vietnam, to French Indochina. At the time, a campaign of many was more than 1,500 kilometers, so of a huge size, involving vast numbers of people on all sides. So a really, really significant campaign that changed the fate of China. They first began up in the, so it's actually geographically simple. We begin in the north, and then we march our way first through Penang, then we cross the Yangtze River, which you can see there, and then the Japanese army slashed through Hunan, as well as Guangxi, and they went into Guizhou, they got close to Sichuan. So for those of you whose geography of China is limited, simply think of it as going from almost from Mongolia to French Indochina, and then take a right towards Chongqing. They got there as well. So I'm not going to point out a lot of the maps, but just so you can see the kind of geographical scale these armies fought over. It's just amazing. Now I think the first question we must address is why? Why did Japan do this? And on the Chinese side, the reason it became such a disaster for China is because they had not anticipated that Japan would do this in 1944, as it had been, it was suffering defeats everywhere. It was, its navy was being ousted all over the place. So why? Why did they do this? Now the official reason, endorsed by the emperor, was that the goal was to neutralize the 20th Bomber Command of the Americans, whose station was at Chengdu, near Chongqing, the wartime capital of China. 20th Bomber Command, they flew the B-29s, the fortress in the sky, and they would fly from Chengdu towards Japan. That was the plan. They didn't actually do this. The plan was to do that, to start the bombing of Japan. And one of the things I want to bring out in the history that I'm writing is, to get away from this goodies and baddies thing, is the Americans planned to do this, but they also used China as a trial place for bombing. And so when the B-29s came in Chengdu, they were supplied over the Himalayan mountains. That was actually very difficult to do, and they started trying this sort of terror bombing in China. They flattened Wuhan, absolutely flattened it. This is not a story that has ever been told. But people like Curtis LeMay, who was in charge of the US Air Force, used China to experiment with the terror bombing, and then it goes on to China from the Mariana Islands, which had been liberated a year later to the Bertrunich. And so I think those are the kinds of stories that also need to be told. Often they're understandable, but they're also difficult. Nobody, the citizens in Wuhan talk about this, but it is not part of the official history. It needs to be part of the official of our history. So the officially endorsed imperial view was that Japan needed to occupy all these airfields that the Americans were building up in China to prevent these kinds of bombing raids that were going to come. That was the officially endorsed view. But I think there were others, and we know that from various Japanese accounts and memoirs. One of them was that the man in charge of the China Expeditionary Army, General Hata Shinroku, decided that what he was going to try to do was get to Chongqing, defeat the nationalists after all. In 1938, after Japan had invaded, they stopped at Wuhan. That's where they stopped. This was not because they could not go further, but because Japanese strategy was to create a federal China with lots of local governments, which then they would oversee and control and supervise. So they wanted to create a federated government, and then concentrate. And in order to concentrate on the enemy, they feared much more, not America, of course, but the Soviet Union, where they had a long border through Manchuria at the time, facing the Soviets. So the Soviet Union was always enemy number one for the Japanese. And so Japan's strategy in 1938 was not to defeat all of China, but simply to create various local governments, of which the nationalist government could be a part. By 1944, General Hatta had decided this wasn't working, we need something else. What we really need is a decisive Klauswitzian victory, an absolute victory, so that we can impose our will on the Japanese. So go defeat. And I think one of the questions that is worth thinking about, if Japan had done this, and they got very close, of course, in 1944, if Japan had done this in 1938, could they have succeeded? What would have happened had they succeeded? We would have had a very different sort of East Asia than we do now. So these are human decisions that are important. So I think there were other reasons. The Japanese could not know that the demand for unconditional surrender was for real, and that so they probably wanted. In Tokyo, people were thinking, okay, we need a victory somewhere, not only to improve morale at home, but also to bring the Allies to the negotiation table. And then maybe we can hang on to a few things like Manchuria, Taiwan, and get a better peace. So I think that was another motivation for this campaign. Where you're going to get a victory easily, well, it is going to be China. That is going to be the place that is going to happen. I think generals on the ground, too, wanted to keep campaigning just to keep their soldiers busy, which is what generals do. They keep their soldiers busy, often pointlessly so. Anybody who has served in the army, I see heads shaking already. Yes, that's what they do. They just keep you busy. So that's, I think, was another point. Another point, of course, was this. By this time, there was enormous amounts of famine in China. So seizing large areas with lots of food crops, no doubt, was another point as well. So those, I think, are the reasons for Ichigo. Ichigo, as a campaign, went in 3 stages. First is north, above the Yangtze, so the first northern red bit on the map you see there. Then there's the second phase that is really the decisive campaigns in Hunan province, especially the campaign for a city named Henyang. And I will come to that in a bit more detail. And I'm not going to talk a great deal about all these military things, because I'm not sure that is going to be really interesting to many people here tonight, but I could, if you want me to do so, in the Q&A, in the questions and answers session. But I think a number of things can be brought out. For instance, about the first phase, even very quickly. It lasted from... My microphone, yes, it is still working. The campaign proceeded far better than the Japanese believed possible in their wildest dreams. Their main aim was to to clear the railroad between Beijing, Peking, and Wuhan. There is a railroad there, and they wanted to clear that so that they could combine this. They could link this up. Ultimately, one of the ideas behind Ichigo was to clear the railroads from Beijing all the way to Vietnam, so that if control over the Pacific was lost, then all the supplies, the oil, the tin, the soldiers, the food, the rubber, could be shipped overland to Japan. And in fact, some of the war planning for Ichigo had begun in 1943, and the plan was to do this, rebuild the Chinese army, rebuild the Japanese army, rebuild the Japanese navy, rebuild the Japanese air force, and then strike back against the Americans from the Philippines, in fact. So there was a larger military campaign, military planning behind this. So in Henan, in the first phase, from 25 April to early June, but very quickly, the Japanese used 4 divisions, about 100,000 men in the Japanese case, 1 tank division, a motorized brigade, plus artillery. They crossed the Yellow River between Kaithon and Zhengzhou, and then immediately thrust south to Xuchang. And one of the aims was not just to take the big cities of Zhengzhou and Luoyang, but also to wipe out the main force of General Tang Enbo, who was one of the most significant generals on the nationalist side. And again, one of the things I want to do with this project is to make people like this better known around the world. We need to know more than just about the American and the British generals, or the German generals. The Chinese ones are also important. And I'm using a lot of diaries and memoirs to humanize these people and think about them a bit more effectively. I think one of the interesting moments is this when, in this particular phase of the campaign, is when the Japanese have surrounded Loyang, and Chiang Kaishek orders defense for a number of weeks. The Japanese think this is hopeless. They use Buddhist monks to go into Loyang, talk to the generals, and say, you know, surrender. Just do that, and that will save a lot of lives. And they had to refuse, so that didn't happen. So there had to be a serious campaign for Loyang. This was the famous Buddhist, famous white horse, Baimas, I think it is, in Loyang. And so I think these moments too are important to take account of. Now, what were the reasons for this initial defeat? And obviously there are a number. One of them, clearly a very important one, was that at this time Henan was in famine. There was no food. It was in famine. It had been in famine already for 2 years. That meant that nationalist armies were trying to make a living, cultivate their own fields, and therefore not training. They were also, of course, the nationalist soldiers at this time liked war because it gave them the opportunity to seize, to requisition food, equipment, and so on from the local people. So it was a very unhappy relationship between the army and the local people. The local people were not helping the army, and in fact were often fighting. So that itself, the Henan famine, like the Bengal famine, or the French Indochina famine, is one of those realities that are really important at this time. And one of the reasons, there are many reasons, the main reason is that all the supply, international, China is a food import country, it needs to import food. The Japanese embargoes don't make it possible. Then you have a war situation in which all these armies need to be sustained. Not just the Japanese, but also the nationalist ones. And Japan's and Chiang Kai-shek's strategy was to keep 3.5 to 4.5 million men under arms. They need to be fed. And here's a very important difference with Mao and the communists. They faced the same problem, of course. And Mao very clearly said, we are not going to mobilize, allow any government, any local authority, any army to mobilize to do more than anything that would require 4 to 5% of the local productive value. So keep the government small, reduce your armies if there are famines. So a very small army, a very small base area, a very small government, in order not to exploit the local, not to force the local population to move against you. So a very cautious, limited mobilization. Nonetheless very sizable across China, of course, but not that one that is exploitative. Chiang Kai-shek kept these huge armies in place, thinking these were, his means to ultimately not just prevail against Japan, but also against the communists. So I think that was one reason why they were, in fact, defeated. Low-quality armies. Many people didn't want to serve with their land, of course. So I think that is one reason why the population turned against the communists. So that's famine, and the reasons for that was a very important reason for the defeats. There were other reasons. One was an intelligence, not an intelligence failure. The intelligence was good. The nationalists knew what the Japanese were doing and were anticipating what would happen quite well, but they didn't know how to assess it. They did not think that this was the main attack. They believed that the main attack would come in the south, below, south of the Yangtze River, not in the north. That's why they were slow in responding, where the nationalists were slow in responding and bringing in relief forces and supplying the forces and so on. So it was a failure of judgment, as always in war. Clausewitz reminds us constantly, judgment is key. It's hard to train for it. Judgment is key. And that's where clearly one failure that the nationalists paid for quite heavily. The nationalists had just assumed that this was a feint and therefore didn't respond quickly. I think also, and one of the things I want to bring out in this book, is that Chiang Kai-shek and the Japanese both were fighting according to what I would call conventional industrial war models derived from Europe. Large armies, weapons, machine guns, tanks, etc. So that's how you fight. That was not appropriate for China. And that's where both, I think, actually failed. And I think it's one of the things that only have recently come across. As the communists, who could not have modern weapons because they didn't have the industries and they limited mobilization, Mao Zedong and his colleagues were reading Clausewitz up in Vienna, up in the communist capital. They were translating it. Mao couldn't read. I think it was Russian probably. He couldn't read that, so he had to translate it. And then they would have a seminar every week about what this all meant. And then Mao would draw lessons out of this that fed into his guerrilla warfare base building strategy, also his political strategy. So he learned a great deal from Clausewitz. And I think this too is interesting when we think about this concept of World War II. One thing that comes out of it is, of course, nuclear warfare, atomic bombs, the internet, high-tech. So technologically, it's a big push. And that's what we sort of talk about in Europe and in America a great deal. What also comes out of this is a way of fighting Western conventional armies using a new Maoist strategy based on base areas, guerrilla warfare. Also, lots of politics, avoiding the battlefield. I could go on about it. You see the point. This kind of national liberation war comes out of this. And that will prove just as important in shaping the post-war world as all these technological innovations. And I was surprised to read not long ago that when Al-Qaeda began to consider its strategy, it read Mao. It read other people as well. But according to the US intelligence, they had Mao translated into Arabic. And they would have, right? These are smart people. They need to think about how to fight war against these huge armies. So they're going to look at all these people who have written about how they do that. And Mao is a very clear example. So in that sense, too, the war is going to have long-term effects in a different way than we tend to think. Right, let me then move on to the battles to the south of the Yangtze River. First is the Battle of Changsha, which is the capital of Hunan province, and then to the south of that is the Battle of Hanyang. The Battle of Changsha was very important, not because the battle was fought for a long time, it was quickly lost, but Changsha had been defended 3 times before that, effectively. So that the Chinese were very proud of the defense, the successful defense of Changsha 3 times. This time, they would lose. This is under General Xue Yue. And he had anticipated that they would do the same as what they had done before every time. That is, from Wuhan, drive down in one column, get into Changsha, and then try to occupy it. What he had done until then was fall back, allow them to get into Changsha. After 2 weeks of fighting, the logistical supply line of the Japanese is at its end. The soldiers carry 2 weeks of supply, so then you fall on their flanks and you defeat them. This had worked 3 times before. This time, the Japanese did it, of course, differently. You're not going to repeat the same mistake. Once is a pretty stupid thing to do 3 times is really horrible. You're not going to do it the 4th time. But this time they advanced over a very broad front in 3 columns. So a strong one in the middle, but even stronger ones on the side. These have been well trained, including in urban street-to-street fighting and so on. So they were really prepared for a major fight. So Xue Yue's strategy really didn't work. He himself actually left rather early. So that they lost command control that way. That didn't help. And I don't know if you know, but there's an important mountain that overlooks Changsha, which is Yuelu Mountain, famous for its Confucian Academy, as well as other things. And the Nationalists had put all their artillery there, so they could sort of hit the troops as they were advancing. Now this broke down completely because the Japanese were using air power, of course, to get at the artillery, used their own artillery, and then the defense descended, I should say, into chaos because one general in charge of artillery at Yellow Mountain, so this mountain overseeing Changsha, he began ordering in reinforcements from Changsha itself. That means you need to cross the Xiang River. That became so chaotic that many soldiers assumed that, oh well, it's going to be, we are retreating. They thought of it as a retreat. There were not enough boats to get people across, so the whole thing very quickly descended into utter chaos. So that ended very quickly. And I think many of the same problems existed there as well as they did in Henan. It was the Battle of Hengyang that really was the critical battle. Let me see where I'm here. Yes, Hengyang, so it's a little to the south. There had been debates among the nationalists. Are we going to defeat Hengyang, or do we just give it up and retreat further south into Guangxi province? Many people had advocated that. But they had decided to fight for Hengyang because there was an important American air base there. Relations with the United States were bad as it was, for reasons I will come to. And therefore the nationalists decided we cannot give up this base because it will damage relations with the United States too much. We have to defend it. Probably not the right decision. But there was also a propaganda decision about, a propaganda argument about this, and the battle would last from 20 June to 8 August, so a long time. And the nationalists built this up as China's Battle of Stalingrad. This is where we will turn the Japanese away. This is where we will stop their advance. This is where we will show, etc. They were talking about it like that. There's also a railroad from Hengyang to Guilin, and it will supply this. There were 3 defenses around the city. They were well prepared with fortifications and things like that. Much of the land had been flooded to make sure that Japanese mechanized vehicles couldn't cross into this. And so they held out for a very, very long time indeed. The first offensive began on the 25th of June. It was led to heavy fighting, but the third line of defense held. There was a second large Japanese offensive on the 11th of July. The nationalists were driven back to their second line of defense, but there was no collapse. It remained okay. And the Japanese had run out of supplies. But General Tojo, who was then the premier in Japan, he needed a victory in order to keep his cabinet alive. So he resupplied, sent in new forces, mobilized also forces in Canton. And so then they pressed ahead. The messages that went back and forth between this city and Chongqing, the capital, make very sad reading, because they are about, yes, we're still seeing some movement. So the airplanes that were flying above, they were sending back messages to Chongqing. We're still seeing some movement, so the defense is holding. The last message of the defending general, Fang Xinjue, was, they had run out of everything. Many soldiers were laying dead. He said, well, in the next street, something like that. We're going to give up, and I will see you in the next life. It's a very Christian message. And these messages were published in Chongqing in order to show that there were still troops willing to fight, that morale, military morale remained strong. It was, of course, a little embarrassing to find that this General Fang Xinjue had actually surrendered to the Japanese and remained alive. He was by nationalist secret intelligence. He was picked up later and brought to Chongqing, where he was given a hero's welcome again, to suggest that this man really had given everything to sort of improve morale on the nationalist side. Can you remind me how long I have? When would you like me to stop? I can clearly go on for a very long time. 15 minutes, is that? Yeah? 15 minutes, okay. Sorry? Do we? Okay, I can do that. So I will first point out Pyongyang. So here, this is Changsha, that's where this battle was. Then they moved into, this is where Henyang, the most significant battle. Then the Japanese, then 1/4 went from Canton. So 1/4 went from Canton also to this, and then the Japanese started moving towards Chongqing. By this time, there was a real fear that Chongqing was going to fall. And if you read memoirs, it makes really very sad reading, because school people, school children, school kids were ordered in nationalist schools to sleep with their luggage packed, to move away with their school to safety, move further back. These are people, some of them were refugees all the way from Manchuria, from Shanghai, from Canton, all the way going back, and then they were ready. And then you get sort of these messages between school children and their parents who would go into different directions. How will I find you? Daddy, how will you know where I am? I'm your father. I will find you. It's that kind of message became. So there was a real fear of collapse. Some of these more humane stories in a minute, but I want to, so there's this collapse, and I want to move into some of the larger historical consequences first, and then I will talk about some of the cultural and human consequences of this, of what was going on. In terms of, and I'm sure you have anticipated this, the communists, well, I think one point to make is that for the Japanese, this huge effort was a waste of time. Their strategic position did not improve. They would never be able to create this link through railroads to French Indochina, to Malaysia, Thailand, and so on. But more importantly, by the time this war, the Ichigo, was over, the Americans had the Mariana Islands, from which it was much easier to conduct these bombing raids. And of course, then you have the atomic bomb. So you can, we've talked about why they did so, but in the end, their strategic position did not improve. The strategic position of the nationalists also did not improve. They lost the last main food areas, recruitment areas. They were driven back to Chongqing. They have no power. It is the communists who really improve their situation. To make that point, let me put it this way. 1943 was a great year for the nationalists. This was the year that Chiang Kaishek was at Cairo. And you may, sort of in your mind, you may have at least this photograph of Chiang Kaishek, Churchill, and Roosevelt sitting together in Cairo, in fact the ambassador's garden. And Churchill looks very annoyed, because he is annoyed, because Roosevelt has used Chiang Kaishek to begin to undo the British Empire. One reason that he is pro-China, Sung Mei-lin, Madam Jiang, and so on, makes big speeches in America. China is for, Roosevelt is using China as Japan's Asian other. And Roosevelt could not get involved in India, but he could push back against the British Empire everywhere else, and he does so clearly in China. And that's why you have Chiang Kaishek at Cairo. 1943 was also the year that China ends the period of the unequal treaties. They sign new treaties, new alliances, new trade treaties on the basis of equality. So that, and all the concessions, all the foreign privileges, all the territories of foreigners are all eliminated. This is symbolic at this time, because Chiang Kaishek is only in Chongqing, but it is very important. It ends a century of humiliation. So one of those wonderful notes you get from some of the memoirs. When these were signed, the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia was rung, if that is what you do to a bell, a couple of times to sort of to announce this liberty for China in this kind of way. Very nice symbolic action. Don't know if it's true, but it makes a good story. It is a memoir, it may well be. It's a diplomatic data, it probably is true. The nationalists felt so secure that in the summer of 1943, they prepare for a campaign against the nationalists that will take Penang. So in 1943, Chiang Kaishek also publishes China's Destiny, which is his great statement about the history of China, the unequal treaties, Sun Yat-sen, why Sun Yat-sen went wrong. Then the nationalists come in, and it is under nationalist leadership that everything is great, that we achieve national independence, and therefore his real challenge is, you communists, we have done all this, you now need to fall into line, or history will destroy you, because we are now on the go. So this is a moment of great triumph, 43. Chiang Kai-shek can see an end of the war with the Americans helping him. And he's also in Cairo, he's arguing for, he's presenting himself as an Asian leader. He's at Cairo, he convinces Churchill and Roosevelt that China will include Taiwan. It will include Manchuria. It will include Xinjiang. He also forces them to accept the independence of Korea. Churchill was furious, because he knew what that meant. This is the beginning of the end of empire. He also insisted that French Indochina would become independent. Roosevelt is fine with that. Churchill doesn't like de Gaulle, so he goes along with that as well. The usual English-French relationship, you know, etc., etc. So that's fairly obvious. But Churchill was very, very unhappy at Cairo. He knew that this was just a bad thing. So in 1943, Chiang Kai-shek can think, you know, after all this, I am going to be the one savior of China. A year later, it is completely reversed. He's only left in Chongqing. And we can see that, and I'm going to be short about this, we can see that the nationalists and the communists were negotiating. They were negotiating in 43. The communist Mao said that we're facing such a terrible situation, we need to make a deal with the nationalists. And we're willing to do all kinds of things. But as Ichigo marches on, the nationalist, communist negotiation position toughens very quickly. And I will say, and one of the things that the growth of the Chinese communists between 44 and 45 is enormously rapid. Their army goes from their army goes from 500,000 to 1 million. By the fall of Japan, they claim to control 1/4 of China, 100 million people. What has happened is that because to do Ichigo, the Japanese had to concentrate their forces across China, creating all these empty spaces behind, sort of on the eastern side of these red lines. That's all that is open for communist infiltration. They move in very quickly, and they move in especially into Shandong province, which is up there, with the box around it, in order so that they can then go into Manchuria or into the south. Mao is very strategic in thinking all this through. He knows where to place his pawns very well. And so the communists flood into these areas. And as that is happening, for a deal, the communists strengthen their, they increase their demands. In May 1944, they demand merely the implementation of democracy, freedom of speech, the legalization of the party, implementation of local self-rule. In August 1944, this is at the time of the Battle of Shenyang, the CCP demanded constitutional government within 1 year of the defeat of Japan, as well as, and then by the end of the month, they demand a joint government, so of the communists and the nationalists sitting together in one government. And by October, as they begin to move, as the Japanese begin to move towards Chongqing, the communists, it is actually on the anniversary of the 1911 revolution, symbolically very important, they demand not only a joint government, but also joint control of all armies. Chiang Kai-shek has been willing to negotiate from the beginning of the war, from before that, accepting everything except he will not give What he demands is that the communists give up their own armed forces. That is his red line. He will never get away from that. Now, by the end of 1944, the communists not only say they were not going to do that, they also want control over, or joint control over nationalist armies. So that's how quickly, and militarily, the communists push forces. They have two rings. They push forces towards this, the guidelines, the war planning of the communists by the end of just before the fall of Japan are seize the big cities. So as Japan falls, immediately the communist forces immediately must move into Shanghai, Nanjing, Guangzhou, Suzhou, Hangzhou, so on. Really the key areas for China economically. They also move forces towards central China, towards Wuhan, building what they could say, they are building a dike so that the nationalists will not be able to cross that dike and get back to the main areas of where they had come from, the Shanghai area, let's put it that way, the Jiangnan area. And many Chinese communists are ready to talk about victory for them right away. Now, there are, I think, also important cultural reasons behind all this. Let me see, I need my glasses. There's a culture war going on in China at this time. And a really decisive moment comes when one of China's most famous authors, Guo who becomes a culture czar after 1949, he publishes, and I think this is absolutely fascinating, he publishes an essay called In Commemoration of the 300th Anniversary of 1644. You may wonder why that is important. Well, what happened in 1644 was the fall of the Ming dynasty. And history is so important, of course, in these kinds of debates. And 1644 was the fall of the Ming dynasty. The Ming dynasty fell to a peasant movement led by Li Zicheng, who defended the Suen dynasty, but he in turn was then defeated by a combination of Wu Sangwei and the Manchus came. This is an historical, to European audiences I need to spell out what this means. I think to a Chinese audience I don't. But I will just, clearly the comment he is making is, and he compares in this article, it's just a historical article, but the parallel, of course, is that Mao Zedong is Li Zicheng. He is the leader of this peasant movement. Chiang Kaishek is not the man he's said to be in China's destiny, but he is the last emperor of the Ming, who will be defeated by this Li Zicheng. And of course the Manchus stand for the Japanese, and that's the historical parallel. And he is arguing, in Guo, he really is arguing that this Li Zicheng will succeed. Now, why this article also becomes important, because Mao in Yan'an takes this article and uses it in what is called the Yan'an rectification movement, which he uses to discipline the party. And he chooses to interpret it as a warning about the pride after victory. Because Li Zicheng, the peasant leader, when he had taken Beijing, went what you would expect him to do, have a good time. They started arguing amongst each other, they started partying, they started bells, etc., etc. So Mao was really saying, this is a historical example that is important to us, because this is what we're not going to do. And in fact, that begins, I think, give us some insight into why we get the rectification campaigns in the People's Republic. This is what he is afraid of. That is his nightmare. We will be like Li Zicheng. And these analogies with Ming history keep cropping up at least until the rise of Deng Xiaoping. But Guo Moro is doing something that I think is even more interesting than this. Guo Moro is a very interesting person. He is a romantic poet. He is an archaeologist. He's a great essay writer. Not everybody likes him. He also does all kinds of other writings. But he's also saying in this article, he's explaining that Li Zicheng, the peasant leader, did well when he listened to intellectuals. And he also gives a warning: kill less. Li Zicheng did better when there was less killing, and when he trusted the intellectuals. The way that I read this is that this is a way, what has happened in this war is that China, the choices in China are reduced to that between the nationalists and the communists. Before that there were lots of other options. But in this process of war, in Ichigo and so on, the two that are standing are the communists and the nationalists. And Guomoro, as an intellectual, is saying here, yes, I think the communists are likely to win, but it's not going to be a victory without dangers. And there is a warning here. So he's beginning to come to terms with a party that has going to have ferocious power and that is going to control the political system. And he wants to position the intellectuals in a way that they can help modify this kind of... He knows what's coming. He's an historian. He does know what's coming. And he tries to find a way through that he can work best. I'm almost out of time. I want to just leave you with a different perspective, which is also, I think, very interesting and also talks to... one of the things I want to bring out is that war was a hugely creative, culturally, politically moment in which lots of interesting... When we think about China, we talk about the May 4th movement. Well, it's in the War of Resistance. Lots of really interesting things happen culturally, in literature, in poetry, in film. But there is one memoir that I came across by a Taiwanese, well, she grew up first in Manchuria, then in Nanjing, went to Chongqing, went through the war in Chongqing, by stroke of luck, not by political commitment, ends up in Taiwan, where she translates a lot of English romantic poetry. This is a woman named Qi Bangyuan who wrote Ju Liuhe. I don't know if that's a novel that has made it, a memoir that has made it here, but it is a beautifully crafted, very elegant, very sensitive novel. It's not a novel, it's a memoir of her history as she grows up in this war. And there are two moments that I think I should share with you. One is that she is in love with she's from Manchuria, somebody else from Manchuria has had a terrible time as the Japanese occupied Manchuria. His father was boiled alive, things like this. So she's very sensitive. She doesn't go into any great grotesque detail, but it's there. He becomes Christian. He decides, despite his pacifist instincts, as the Japanese, he must join the Chinese Air Force. He flies above Loyang during this Ichigo campaign. He is shot down and killed. And they have love letters, and he actually has made sure that his love letters are returned to her by a friend. So he's left her sort of a testament, if I die, do this, these love letters are brought back. She cries, of course. She cries at the moment of victory. That too, I think, is a very important expression. And she, I think, and she's at the same time describing her own schooling. So she learns a lot of British romantic poetry, lots of novels, and so on. And what she is, and she's a very, she's very intelligent. So what I think she is saying is that China in World War II, what China did, it had to resist Japan. So its best men were sent to war, men that she would love. But China also sent people to schools, to learn, to study, to be teachers, to maintain, in other words, that aspect of China's culture and China's civilization, of great learning, of respect for learning. So China took its youth and sort of split it in two parts. And one had to fight and die, and one to learn, to learn, to learn again, in order to sustain civilization, humanity, and learning, and all those things. And that is a very moving interpretation. And she writes about when she visits in Sichuan, she visits Happy Mountain, Leshan, which is a famous mountain in Sichuan, famous because this is also where the great poet, Du Fu, wrote 1,000 years earlier, when China again was in this great period of utter war and violence and nastiness, and he found some respite from that nastiness, to leave us with the greatest, some of the greatest poems of that China has ever come out of China. And I think that is what she is saying. There is much more to this war, and that's sort of the theme that I get back to. There is so much to this war that if we begin to look at it from a Chinese perspective, that is so important and so different than just a fight against Japan. It was also about a fight for a certain civilization, a certain set of human values, of care, of concern. And I think that too is important. And I think that's sort of how that is the kind of thing that I want to see brought out about these kinds of experiences in World War II. And I'm just very happy we can begin to do so. I have detained you for too long, and I apologize for that. But I thank you for listening, and I would be very happy to answer any questions now or later, as you like. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans, for this wonderful lecture. Indeed, it's an eye-opener for many people, whether it's from the Chinese perspective or whether it's from the Japanese perspective. Perhaps I should start off with a question to you. And how do you think the civil war in China affected the cross-strait relationship, the current cross-strait relationship with Taiwan?
I mean, it's clearly I think it's very interesting that we can't have the Taiwan PRC issue is a clear legacy of the Second World War. And just sort of to add one note to what I was saying earlier, at Cairo, China, and it relates to this, Roosevelt asked Chiang Kaishek, told Chiang Kaishek, after the war, China will occupy Japan and take care of Japan. Now, history would have been very different had that happened, wouldn't it? It's utterly decisive. Chiang refused for, I think, some obvious reasons. But I think this geographic scape, the political relations, international relations are clearly, between the Taiwan and the PRC, are coming out of this. But we are also, so what I have seen in the period that I have been paying attention to these issues is a huge chain towards the war in China. Up until the mid-80s, we wouldn't talk about Chiang Kaishek in China, right? It was not you could have mentioned it. You wouldn't talk about the nationalists. It was, if anybody defeated the Japanese, it was the communists. Now, it's, even in mainland textbooks, it's the other way around. Chiang Kai-shek is now a hero in China. He is no longer a hero in Taiwan. But he is popular in China. And Xi Jinping, we can have various thoughts about what Xi Jinping is trying to do. But I do think what he is trying to do with the war is both interesting, and it is he's trying to create this victory of Japan as a national story, so that all sides can relate to that. But it is more to, it is not just, I think, an IR issue. It is also about creating a dignified place for all those who had attachments to the nationalists, who were on the wrong side of history when they stayed in the mainland China. And now in the commemorative events this year, or last year, of the 70th anniversary, he made sure to include not just communist veterans, but also nationalist veterans. And the three commemorative dates, two are, one is the Nanjing Massacre, of course, and one is in Beijing, and one is, of course, the beginning of the invasion. At those commemorative events, he always makes sure to have veterans from both sides. So I think, in terms of creating a society where all these class differences All these personal struggles are a thing of the past. For the war to be used as a unifying story in a way to overcome these legacies of hatred between the nationalists and the communists, I think is actually very positive.
All right. So perhaps at this point we should open up the floor for questions from the floor.
Professor Hans, you have attributed the success of the communists in China to small tax, low tax, and smaller troops. Whereas from my understanding, during the 1930s, Chiang Kaishek has to maintain a huge troops because there are so many warlords there. And the reason they have to, Kuomintang is trying to take back China from these warlords. And it's because of the Japan's invasion that caused those warlords to turn against the Japanese and form an alliance. Right? So it seems to me that Chiang Kai-shek's failure has nothing to do with him keeping huge troops.
Okay, if I can answer that. And thank you for that comment and that question. I think the argument that all these warlords suddenly forgot their differences is a little simple. The warlords in the north in 1937 declined to fight, right? When the Japanese came in, they didn't fight. They fell back. There's the great example of Yan Xishan, who made a deal with the Japanese. Long Yin, no friend of Chiang Kaishek whatsoever. These things continued. And so my argument is that the vast number of soldiers, the conventional way of fighting, that put an enormous pressure on Chinese society, on the peasantry. As always, the peasantry is the great loser in the 20th century. That pressure in many areas of China open up opportunities for mobilization, activation for the communists, which they used very effectively. And in many areas, the nationalists, by the end of the war, and I think in the first 2 years of the war, the situation was pretty good. And there is a clear war fever. I think that is true, especially among the youth. But even they rather go to Yan'an than to. But it's the pressure by the end of the war, the enormous poverty and the enormous demands for ever more young men, more food for the armies that turns that by the end of the war, the nationalists drag young men out of the villages if they can. And of course, many families hide their young men, and so it becomes sort of a trade in this thing. They also, go into the countryside to collect the food. It is a truly horrible situation. And I'm not saying. I think what I'm trying to do in this, in what I'm arguing, is get beyond the arguments of who lost and why, but get to the deeper meanings, the deeper consequences of this war, culturally, in terms of literature, in terms of social structures, of course, and in terms of Chinese history. Sort of who lost and why, did Chiang Kai-shek or Mao, etc. I don't think that is really, those are the questions that were debated by a first generation, important questions, of course, and more can be said after, in the wake of 45 and 49. But I think now we're becoming interested in the kinds of questions about culture, the kinds of things that Overlord talked about historical consciousness, but also about the deeper meanings for China's culture and civilization, the kinds of questions that this memoir that I quoted at the end by Qi Bangren, that she talked about. So those are broader aspects of what China and war. So I don't think it's just a one-sided set of issues.
And we talk about the communists of tax the locals at a lower rate, and to keep small troops. But it is from understanding that even during those 30s, that Chiang Kai-shek has tried to conduct a land reform in China, but failed. And primarily because he needed to keep the support of those so-called other than farmers, people other than farmers, like landowners. And it will not be fair to Chiang Kai-shek to say that, I mean, sorry, I didn't quote it right.
If it is a reassurance to you and to many other people, one of the things that I have done in my work is to rehabilitate Chiang Kai-shek in the eyes of the European readers, because I think he faced a very difficult situation. The enormous condemnation after the Second World War of China, of Chiang Kai-shek, by Stilwell, I didn't talk about it today, I don't agree with at all. And I'm known in the United States as the one who really destroyed Stilwell's, even the Pentagon talks about this, destroyed Stilwell, the great American hero. I destroyed his reputation. The People's Daily writes about me as the one who introduced the truth about the nationalists and about the communists to the Western world. So just to blame Chiang Kai-shek for mismanagement is not what I'm arguing. It is absolutely not. He fought in a way, I can be critical, I think he made mistakes, of course he did, there was terrible aspects to what he did, but he had to mobilize a very poor agricultural country against one of the most vicious, advanced, industrialized, modern fighting machines in the world. He did pretty well. That is my argument. So I hope that is some, I am not a Chiang Kai-shek beta at all. That's not what I do. So I didn't want to talk about Stilwell and why I think Stilwell is so wrong, because I've talked about that a lot already. So Stilwell's reputation is gone. That issue is gone. And again, that's why I think we need to move beyond these sets of issues and get to what's very sensitive people, like Chi Pang-yuan, and she is this young woman who goes through the war from Manchuria, not part of the center of the Nationalist Party, but knowledgeable about it. How she, as a good woman growing up, what she makes of this work, with kinds of very cosmopolitan, and she's reading Chinese classical poetry, but also Western romantic poetry, and what sort of she makes of this. That I find very interesting. And there are many other stories like this that I introduce in this. Okay.
It seemed that Operation Ichigo pretty much wrapped up in December 44. Could you elaborate a little bit on what happened to the Japanese army after that until the fall of Japan in August 45?
Okay. The map is gone, which is probably just as good because I plagiarized it from the US Army website. So please don't talk about this outside this room. This is what they use at West Point to talk about Ichigo, if they talk about it. I doubt they talk about it. It went on actually until April, and one of the things that I think one of the outcomes of this, so that the Japanese army by April they were ready. They could have gone into Chongqing. They could have done that, but they decided not to. The order came in to concentrate near Shanghai because they were expecting American landings there. There was disagreement in the Japanese army who said, no, we shouldn't do that. What we should do was take Chongqing and eradicate that danger, especially if there's going to be an American landing. We might as well get rid of the nationalists so they can't. But the real change, and again this is related to the Stilwell issue I was just talking about, the real change comes when Stilwell is fired by Chiang Kaishek, or he's recalled by Roosevelt on the urgings of. That's it, and that's, if you don't know that, it's complicated, but I don't want to go into that. But they bring in Albert Wedemeyer. He brings in Chinese forces fighting then in Burma, who are armed and trained by the Americans, who are very good forces. And then he uses those to block the Japanese advance towards Chongqing. And there's also other forces come in fact, from Henan. But so it's a Japanese being ordered back to Shanghai that ends it. Plus the move by Wedemeyer to block the approaches to Chongqing. In fact, Wedemeyer has advised to Chiang Kaishek, he said, forget Chongqing, you're going to have to give it up, protect Kunming. Because Kunming is where all the supplies are being flown in from the United States. So so Chongqing doesn't fall. So that's at least a positive step. But the consequence of all these moves, the Americans do begin to train more Chinese forces, and they're ready to move towards begin a counteroffensive of sorts. I think one of the consequences of the atomic bomb, so the rapid fall of Japan, because it's the Americans through the Pacific War, and then in the final days of the war, the Soviets will go into Manchuria. Those two movements, not just the Pacific War, those two force the collapse of Japan. America's policy after Ichigo, so in Cairo, Roosevelt had still wanted to turn China into one of the four great powers, one of the pillars of the post-war order, being the pillar of a new world order in East Asia. One of the consequences of Ichigo is that the Americans give up on the nationalists, Roosevelt included, which is one reason they go to Japan. And that the American policy becomes to get out of East Asia as quickly, of China, as quickly as possible. Bring the boys back home. Because what the Americans have always feared, is that the American population does not want to fight for a long time. As General Marshall, who is in charge of the military United States, as he puts it, a democracy does not fight a 7 years war. Actually, he ended up doing that. But getting the boys home, that was the key. So as soon as Japan surrendered, what Wedemeyer does is to order every liaison officer with all nationalist forces out of those forces. And the policy is to the Americans take a number of ports, Shanghai, Tianjin, they concentrate all Japanese civilians and military in those ports, and then take them to Japan. And what this does, that's the policy. The reason that they adopt this policy is that prevents any resurgence, that prevents the Japanese from continuing the war using Japanese troops in China. So that's an important reason. But you take all the Japanese, the people you really, your enemies, you can't trust them, you don't know what's going to happen, you take them all back to Japan, which is under American occupation, so you can supervise them and turn them into American-style Democrats, if I might put it that way. And so once you're doing that, you can get out of China. And that's what they try to do, essentially do. And they sent Marshall as a negotiator between the communists. So instead of actually sending significant supplies or doing anything militarily in China, they sent a famous person instead of one as a way of. So I think it's the strategy is lock Japan up in Japan, supervise that, get out of China. I think there were other questions somewhere in the back.
The motivation of the Japanese, which I've lived in Japan for a number of years, and it just strikes me that it's a bit hard to understand why the Japanese would tie up so many troops at a time when they were clearly on the defensive. To tie up 500,000 troops when the US was gradually hopping from one island to the other with this, they were beginning to lose many of the major sea battles and so on. It's a bit difficult to understand. Of course, you have to be careful, because we know now, in hindsight, everything looks so clear than it was. Why did they let the British escape from Dunkirk, basically? Several hundred troops, thousand troops. It's hard to understand why that happened. And why did he postpone the invasion of Russia by 6 weeks? If he had 6 more weeks, he probably would have reached Moscow and so on. But this is another example of this. What was it? Was it because it was a low-hanging fruit in some ways? They were clearly up against the major industrial power of the world, which was overwhelming Japan because of that, to a large extent. And he was probably some easy routes, even though Belarus and the Japanese were not a flourishing democracy, public opinion, morale, and so on, tolerance. So maybe they were tempted to sort of pick some low-hanging fruits and in that sense hope to at least boost morale, and maybe also knowing that there was, as you mentioned yourself, voices in the US who always said we really need to continue, so I'm hoping that these people will benefit. I'd just like to hear your comments about that.
Yes, thank you for that. I mean, I use my text as the phrase low-hanging fruit.
Okay.
So I think that is, well, if you're apt, I can claim to be apt as well. So that's hopefully a phrase. But I think it is both, you can take this at two levels. Why does Japan, it's actually 1 million troops, it's 500,000 concentrated for the Ichigo Campaign. The rest to occupy China. So it's 1 million troops. But these are not frontline troops. These are all reservists. So they are older people who have done their first round of service, often the second round of service, the third round of service. So there are some newer ones are brought in. So these are not the ones that you're actually going to want to use against the Americans, for instance, or the Russians, for that matter. So I think that's. But I think I mentioned too that I think it's getting a victory somewhere, both for morale, but also in the hope of forcing the Allies to the negotiation table. Because unconditional surrender, who knows? Do you really mean that? And in fact, of course, the Japanese surrender was not unconditional. The demand was, and the Allies knew this, the demand was that the emperor would stay in place. And that demand was made, and the answer of the Allies was that, we'll talk about it, but indicating it was not out of the question, at least. So I think it wasn't really an unconditional surrender. One indication of the poverty, of the lack of power by the end of the war of Chiang Kaishek is that, so he had been disimported at Cairo, where Churchill had built him up, and he had used him to sort of downgrade Churchill and his desire for maintaining these militarized empires. Like India didn't want to do that. So at Cairo, Chiang Kaishek was hugely important. The Potsdam demand, set of demands that forced the Japanese surrender, he received the text of that only a couple of hours before it was delivered to Japan. It omitted, the only thing he could change was that it should include the demand. It's sort of we, the United States, China, and the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. I think that is the actual order. The China wasn't originally there at all, not even in second place. So that tells you how his star had fallen, I think, better than anything else. I think the other question that actually I think is, which I find very difficult to answer, is why did Japan do any of this? And you can give some answers. They knew that they were not, if it came to mobilization in 1937 when it began, they knew that they would not be able to win. Ultimately, in the end, Japan faced all the major powers. The Soviet Union, the UK, the USA, and China. Why a small country ends up fighting so many powers surely is a sign of absolute, well, can I say, stupidity. And that is, I think, that is a what-if question, so we're not going to be able to answer it in any definite sort of way. But it has to do with, the easy answers are that the Navy and the Army didn't cooperate. That was one of the decision-making was a big problem. There was of course, there was the whole problem of the military controlling politics in the end. That was another problem. You can ask questions about what the emperor was up to. I think it's also to do with, this also happens, of course, in other cases in military conflicts. In 1937 and especially in 1941, it's the longer we wait, the worse our position will be. We must strike now. Let's hope, it's a gamble, let's hope with an audacious act we will be able to negotiate the kind of peace we want. There is, and I think there is again a reason why I want to get away from this good guy, bad guy situation. This is a period when lots of, in the 1930s, as we move towards the Second World War, which I would say begins in 37, not 39. You have various blocks that are preserving resources from themselves, and it's the United States that is isolationist, of course. The British have this empire bloc, you have the Russians, the Soviets, and so on. And Japan is a small country, becoming very heavily militarized. And there is this fear of shortages, of scarcity. And therefore the Japanese, what the Japanese, like the Germans, want, they think they need, and they can only get it through military operations, of course, which is quite fortunate, is that they need to go occupy. So they go occupy, the Germans want the Caucasus for the oil, the Ukraine for food, and Japan goes into Manchuria for some of those reasons, to China for the food and for the people. Manchuria is to create more land, and of course the Germans do the same, and then they move into the Japanese move into Southeast Asia for oil, rubber, tin, and so on. I think that says something about the international global order, which had real problems with it, and that is something where I think history is important to all of us as a reminder of, if we do not take care, that we go back to something like that, we're going to probably end up in very dangerous situations. So here, there's something really that should not be forgotten.
In the face of the common enemy, the Ichigo campaign against them.
It's also a very complicated one. There was far more cooperation than people think. There was also far more conflict than people think. And in the same way that the communists also at times cooperated with the Japanese, which is a story that cannot be told in China, obviously. Of course, so did the nationalists. It is a war with a number of... This is, in Europe, the war is what I would call a Clausewitzian dialectic war. Enemy-friendly, clear, done. This is not the case in China. There were moments when there was real cooperation. Especially, of course, in the beginning, but Mao Zedong was, for understandable reasons, China's attack, lots of communists want to fight the Japanese. What does Mao Zedong say? And he is, of course, very, very shrewd and clever. He tells them, what we are going to do is we are going to fight the only way we can, which is guerrilla warfare in mountains on the enemy flank. We are not going to go to the front. And that leads to accusations in the press in China at the time that the communists are not actually fighting at all. So Youji Zhan is, Youji or Puzhan, sort of instead of guerrilla warfare, it works better in Chinese than fighting. But I think there are other moments, for instance, when the Japanese threatened Wuhan and Nanjing, that the communists do put pressure. And of course the communists, I think there is now a tendency in the academic world to say that the communists really didn't matter very much at all. And I think that is very wrong. Because the communists began in the war, in the beginning of the war, they only had Shanxi, bits of the northern part of Shanxi province, north of Xi'an. But they immediately, in the first 2 years of the war, they fanned out across North China, into Shandong, even into central China. They set up bases, even in the lower Yangtze region. And they kept the Japanese busy again and again and again with that kind of base area building, that kind of guerrilla warfare, also with assassinations in the cities. So in that sense, there is real help. And in fact, there's a lot of communication between Yan'an and Chongqing, between Chiang Kaishek and Mao Zedong. Yan'an has a liaison office in Chongqing and vice versa. Not all of that, not very much of that history is actually available. The archives in China are not going to tell us exactly that kind of history just yet. But so I think the communist role should not be underplayed at all. and especially at base building. And from about 42, 43, there are all these mopping up operations by the Japanese. And of course, but both sides also, the nationalists and the communists, also calibrate their own operations to take account of these situations. Of course they do. These are serious people living at a very serious time, making very serious decisions. It's not simple. And so they are going to try to play to their own advantage. Some of these stories are beginning to be now told, revealed by people, by really great historians in China, like Yang Kui-sung is one of them. So this is a complex relationship in which there is more cooperation at times than at others, but at all times there is both cooperation and war and conflict between the communists and the nationalists. I think as a generalization that stands. Mao himself said exactly the same thing.
You suggested that in 44, in the midst of the cooperation between the communists and the nationalists, Mao had already planned the strategies to take over after the Japanese war. Now, what did the nationalists do at that point in time? Now, between 45 and 49, I mean, it took 4 years before the nationalists collapsed. It was 4 long years, and there were points of time when Chiang Kaishek felt that he had to prepare Taiwan already as a base and send over Shenzhen to take over Taiwan. So the collapse of the nationalists after 45 must have happened. The genesis of the collapse must have happened before, and the collapse didn't happen immediately. It happened over a period of time. But are there proper analysis why that happened? What were the real incidences which made the collapse happen faster?
Are there real analysis? Yes, of course there are. And I hope that when I'm finished with writing the book that I'm writing now, I can persuade you to buy a copy and find it. The strength of confidence of the communist side, I think Mao was actually cautious. There were others who had this sort of, in 44, 45, this fall of Japan, this victory fever. The communists demanded, when it came to the surrender, that in the areas that they controlled, the Japanese would surrender to them. And it is because of Allied decisions, so Truman at this time, as well as still Churchill, that the rule is that that the Japanese have to surrender to the nationalists. I think very important here, not to forget, is that the Japanese in China had a choice. They could have surrendered to the communists. There's nobody to prevent them. And we know from the Japanese general's memoirs that he decided to surrender to the nationalists. He got approval from Tokyo. So they had a choice, because this was a limited victory. Therefore, the Japanese still had choices, and they chose to surrender to the nationalists. In fact, nearly 10,000 Japanese died fighting the communists after the surrender of Japan, in order to keep in place. Chiang Kaishek ordered all Japanese forces to stay in place in order to maintain order. That is actually rather embarrassing and will not have helped his reputation. He was depending on his enemy to keep order in China. Mao, Chiang Kaishek knows how fragile the situation is. And this is, of course, at the surrender of Japan, a moment emerges where time speeds up. Decisions in the morning may have consequences in the evening that are going to shape the next century. So this is a very speedy process. Mao, Chiang Kaishek, very early, quickly on, he gives radio broadcasts, which are actually very interesting. Very early on, he invites Mao to come to Chongqing for negotiations. He wants a settlement. He's not that comfortable. Mao, he sends one invitation, Mao Zedong declines. Chiang Kaishek, humiliatingly, he's the great victor, he's defeated Japan, asked his rebel to come. He sends another invitation. Mao again says, no, I'm not going. It is only at the third time that Mao answers the invitation, yes, I will come. He does so because Stalin tells him to. That's why he goes. And Stalin has, by this time, what he wants. A ring of territories on his eastern border, just like a ring of territories on his western border. His armies are in control from Korea, Manchuria. He has a treaty with the Nationalist that gives him Outer Mongolia. Xinjiang is a bit difficult, but he has that whole... So, therefore, Stalin tells Mao, you go. You do not want to be seen as starting a civil war. You now must go. So I think, in terms of why, I think 44 is the turning point. It is because of Japan's willingness, in part, to help Chiang Kai-shek that the Nationalists do not fall right away. This is a very international situation, with Stalin telling Mao not to fight. And I think the Nationalists have supplies for a force of about 30 divisions left, not very much. And they're only half strength in any case. And so they charge into Manchuria. Actually, they have to wait because the Soviets don't allow them to. But when they're finally allowed in, they charge in. I don't quite know, I haven't read Chiang Kai-shek's diaries of this period, but I think that would fit Chiang Kai-shek's character. I think he thinks I have one shot, and I'm going to give it my all. And he goes in with those divisions, and he takes Zippy, the great victory that he has in 46. And after that, the decline is actually quite rapid. But what the communists need to do, before they can take, and I think Mao was cautious in 45, before they can take over, is to transform their forces into very large conventional forces, not conventional, very large forces. And what Mao learns from Clausewitz is that to get the political power to really change your country, to really change society, you need an utterly decisive victory. And he gets that in 48 and 49, as he destroys the three great campaigns in Manchuria, in North China, and again in Central China. He gets that decisive victory, and then he can tell China how to change. Even then it was a little more difficult than you think. So that would be my story. Sorry?
You mentioned that you still have no access to Chiang Kai-shek's diary.
I do have access, but I haven't read those bits. I've read earlier bits, but I'm still.
But the pro-nationalist websites that are currently in discussion talks about arms which the Soviet Union actually passed on to the communists.
Yeah.
And that was decisive after 45.
I think that's right. There are a couple of things to say here. I think the Soviet Union's assistance to the communists was very important in a number of ways, including by handing Japanese arms in Manchuria, but also elsewhere to the communists. That was very important. That gave them the arms. But I don't think it's just a question of arms only. I think the strategy, the thinking, the politics, the cultural arguments were also important in inspiring lots of support for the communists, so I think that was important as well. I think one way in which the Soviets actually made quite a critical difference in 48 was because there was an epidemic in Manchuria. And the Soviets flew in all kinds of medicine and doctors to clear out the epidemic. That epidemic could have done what nationalist armies by that time were unable to do. But again, history is never simple. There's lots of chance and decisions and so on. And especially, I call this momentous times. This is when the world really, really changes. We no longer live in, well, I don't think we live in such times. We don't live in these momentous times. We live in a much more moderate time, which has its own.
It's a very interesting topic, and I think we can go on and on and on for the whole evening. But from what we have heard from this, it seems that the judgment element of it is a great element in terms of determining the success or the failure of any particular operation. So I hope that the lecture has enlightened us a bit more, as well as help us in perhaps making better decisions in the future. So please join me in thanking Professor Van der Vens for giving us this wonderful lecture.
Okay, thank you for the interesting questions just now. So our lecture has come to the end, and we hope to see all of you in our future events. Thank you, good night, and have a nice week ahead.